"You're nothing but a leash holder. You don't belong here." Major Nathan Crowley says it into a microphone, 300 soldiers watching. Then he grabs her arm. Not for demonstration, to break it. Staff Sergeant Lena Vance doesn't scream, doesn't pull away. Her jaw locks. Her eyes go cold. She absorbs every second of it standing completely still, because she has been in rooms far darker than this, and she has never once given a man like him what he wants. But something beside her has had enough. A low growl rises from a Belgian Malinois named Rex, and Major Crowley has just made the worst mistake of his life. If this story already has your attention, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Fort Black Ridge, Texas had a way of testing people. Not through war, not through combat, through the slower, quieter brutality of being surrounded by people who had decided before you ever opened your mouth exactly how much you were worth. Staff Sergeant Lena Vance had been tested that way every single day for the past 14 months. She had learned to take it without blinking. What she hadn't expected was that one afternoon, in front of 300 witnesses, a man with oak leaves on his collar would decide that her composure was a personal insult. The combatives seminar had been scheduled for weeks. It was supposed to be routine, a joint training demonstration designed to show junior enlisted soldiers proper restraint and takedown techniques. Senior NCOs and officers would participate as examples. Standard Army protocol. Nothing unusual. Lena arrived early the way she always did. Rex walked beside her at heel, no leash necessary. The Belgian Malinois moved like an extension of her body, matching her pace, exactly scanning the crowd as they found their position at the rear of the assembled formation. Several soldiers nodded at Rex. A few reached instinctively toward him before catching themselves, remembering that a working dog in a harness was not a pet. Rex ignored all of them. His attention, as always, was on Lena. She found a quiet section of the field, stood at parade rest, and waited. The morning moved normally at first. Officers conducted demonstrations. NCOs ran controlled drills. Junior soldiers rotated through stations learning choke breaks, wrist releases, basic ground defense. Then Major Nathan Crowley took the center of the field. And the energy changed. Lena had encountered men like Crowley before. She recognized the type, the way you recognize bad weather, not by a single sign, but by the feeling in the air before the first drop falls. He was tall, broad, decorated. His uniform was immaculate. His posture radiated the specific confidence of a man who had never once in his career been seriously challenged by someone he outranked. He scanned the assembled formation with the slow, deliberate gaze of someone choosing. Not a training partner, a target. His eyes moved across the rows of soldiers, past the large infantry, NCOs, past the combat arms officers, past the stocky mechanics and thick-necked MPs, and landed on Lena. She felt it before she saw it, that particular weight of being selected. "Sergeant Vance." His voice carried without effort across the field. "Front and center." 300 heads turned. Lena didn't hesitate. She handed Rex's lead to Corporal Davenport, standing beside her, squared her shoulders, and walked forward with clean, measured steps. Rex watched her go. His ears came up. Crowley looked her over slowly when she stopped in front of him. He let the silence sit long enough that it became its own statement. Then he spoke not to her, but to the formation behind her. "Dog handlers." He let the words hang in the air. Anybody know what dog handlers actually do in a real combat scenario? A ripple of uncertain laughter moved through the crowd. "Sir," Lena started. "I didn't ask you." He cut her off without looking at her. Dog handlers track. They search. They handle their animal. He turned to face the formation directly. What they don't do is engage in hand-to-hand. They don't breach. They don't take contact, because they're not trained for it. He finally looked at her. "No offense, Sergeant." The tone made clear he meant every offense imaginable. Lena held her expression level. "No offense taken, sir." Something shifted behind his eyes. Like he'd expected her to flinch, and her refusal to do so had registered as a challenge. "Good." He rolled up his sleeve. "Then you won't mind helping me demonstrate a basic arm control technique for the battalion?" "Of course not, sir." She turned to face him, feet shoulder-width apart, hands loose at her sides. Professional, controlled, ready. Crowley positioned himself to her right. He explained the technique to the formation in broad technical terms, a standard escort hold used to move a resistant subject. He described the pressure points, the leverage principles, the correct angle of rotation. The explanation was accurate. What came next was not training. His grip closed around her right forearm without warning. Hard, deliberate, far beyond what a demonstration required. Lena's breath caught a half-second reaction she couldn't suppress as the pressure drove directly into the joint. He torqued her arm upward. The angle was wrong. Wrong for demonstration. Wrong for technique. It was the angle you use when you want to cause damage. Lena's molars locked together. Every muscle in her core went rigid as she absorbed the force without collapsing. She did not cry out. She did not pull away. She stood perfectly still and let him do it because she understood something in that moment with crystalline clarity. He wants a reaction. Any reaction. Don't give it to him. But behind her, 40 feet away, Rex gave it instead. The growl was low-rolling, continuous. Not aggressive, not yet. Military working dogs were trained too well for undirected aggression. But the sound was unmistakable to anyone who knew dogs. It was a warning. The animal equivalent of, "I see exactly what you're doing, and I am paying attention." Crowley released her arm and glanced toward the dog. Rex stood motionless, ears fully forward, eyes locked on Crowley with the kind of calm, focused attention that is far more dangerous than barking. Crowley looked back at the formation. "Leash your animal, Sergeant." "Rex is under control, sir." "I said leash him." Lena turned to Corporal Davenport, who clipped the lead quickly. Rex sat. He did not look away from Crowley for a single second. Crowley turned back to the formation and dismissed the demonstration with a wave. "Dog handlers." He said it once more, quieter this time, like a conclusion he was satisfied with. The battalion was released to their unit areas. Lena walked back to Rex. Her right arm was already beginning to throb. Corporal Marcus Davenport was 22 years old and had been assigned to the K-9 unit for 7 months. He was observant in the way young soldiers learn to be when they're surrounded by people older and more powerful than them, quietly, carefully, with their eyes always slightly wider than they appear. He waited until they were away from the field. "Sergeant Vance?" He kept his voice low. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "Your arm." "I said I'm fine, Davenport." He stopped walking. "He twisted it wrong. I saw the angle. That wasn't a demonstration." Lena stopped. She turned around and looked at him directly, the kind of look that carries more information than most conversations. "What you saw," she said carefully, "was a training demonstration conducted by a field-grade officer. That is what happened this afternoon. That is what you will say if anyone asks you." Davenport stared at her. "Sergeant, do you understand me?" A long pause. "Yes, Sergeant." "Good." She turned and kept walking. Rex fell into step beside her, leaning slightly against her left leg. She dropped her hand and let her fingers rest briefly on the top of his head. Just for a second. Just long enough to feel the warmth of him beneath her palm. The medical clinic at Fort Blackridge was staffed until 2100 hours on weekdays. Lena arrived at 1845 after the evening formation had cleared and most of the unit had dispersed to the barracks. She signed in under routine maintenance, a standard injury notation that would blend into the ordinary noise of a working military base. Sergeant First Class Michelle Okafor was the duty medic. She was 41, a woman who had been in the Army long enough to recognize exactly what she was looking at when Lena rolled up her sleeve. The bruising had already begun to develop. Okafor's face went still. "When did this happen?" This afternoon. Training. Combatives seminar. Okafor pressed 2 fingers gently along the joint line. Lena's breath tightened but held steady. I need to ask you something, Okafor said, and I need you to answer me honestly. Go ahead. Was this accidental? The silence between them lasted exactly 4 seconds. Documented as a training injury, Lena said. Partial ligament stress, bruising consistent with joint manipulation. Okafor set down her pen. Lena. Treat it and document it, that's all I'm asking. If someone did this deliberately, then I need the documentation, not a complaint. Documentation. She held Okafor's gaze. Please. Okafor looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen again. Partial ligament stress, she said quietly, beginning to write. Severe localized bruising, consistent with joint manipulation under excessive force. She looked up once more. I'm going to keep a copy in a separate file. Lena nodded once. Thank you. She didn't sleep much that night. Rex curled at the foot of her cot the way he always did when he sensed she needed him close, not pressing against her, not demanding attention, just present. A warm, solid breathing anchor. Lena lay in the dark and ran the afternoon back through her mind with the same discipline she had applied to every operational debrief she'd ever conducted. Not emotionally, tactically. What had happened was not random. Crowley had scanned that entire formation, and he had chosen her. That choice had been deliberate. He hadn't picked the largest soldier. He hadn't picked someone who looked aggressive or difficult. He had picked the female K9 handler standing quietly at the rear, someone he expected to absorb the humiliation without consequence. Why? She turned that question over. Not why in the sense of psychology. She understood the psychology perfectly. Men like Crowley performed dominance. It was what they did. They needed witnesses, and they needed targets, and they needed the target to either break or disappear, because either outcome confirmed their power. She was asking a different why. Why me specifically? Why now? Why this publicly and this aggressively? Something had prompted it. She just didn't know what yet. The answer arrived the following morning in the form of a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. She was returning Rex from his morning run when she passed the administration building and caught voices through an open window, raised enough to travel, specific enough to matter. One voice she recognized immediately as Captain Derek Holloway, the battalion adjutant. The other was Crowley. The review panel comes in 6 weeks, Holloway was saying. If Vance submits that formal request before then, she won't submit anything. Crowley's voice was flat and certain. I handled it. You handled it by publicly humiliating her in front of the battalion. That's not handling it, sir. That's escalating it. What I did was send a message, to her and to anyone else watching. And if she files a complaint anyway. A pause. Then we remind her what happens to careers built on accusations. She's got 3 years left until retirement eligibility. She'll weigh that against whatever righteous indignation she's feeling right now, and she'll make the right call. Another pause longer. She doesn't strike me as someone who makes that kind of calculation, sir. Every soldier makes that calculation eventually. I've never met one who didn't. Lena stood motionless outside the window. Rex pressed against her leg. She reached down automatically without thinking and gripped his harness. A formal request. She turned that phrase over carefully. She had put in a formal request 7 weeks ago. A request to review the K9 unit's deployment eligibility criteria, specifically a set of administrative parameters that had been quietly adjusted 18 months prior in ways that limited female handlers' access to forward operating positions. The request had been routine. Policy review. Nothing inflammatory, nothing accusatory. She had not known until this moment that it had landed on Crowley's radar at all. She walked away from the window at a steady pace. She didn't run. Running would mean something had startled her. Nothing had startled her. She had simply received new information. So, That evening, she opened her laptop and began. Not a complaint, not a report, not anything that could be intercepted through official channels. A personal file. She started with what she knew the events of the previous afternoon, documented with timestamps, medical records, attached Okafor's notes cross-referenced. She included the exact words Crowley had spoken to the formation. She listed the names of every soldier she could identify who had been standing within earshot. Then she went further. She pulled the unit's disciplinary log from the shared administrative server, a file she had legitimate access to as a senior NCO. She went back 2 years, then 3. She started reading. It took her 4 hours. By the time she stopped, it was past midnight, and Rex had moved from the foot of the cot to lying directly beside her, his head resting across her thigh. The pattern in the records was unmistakable, not because it was obvious it wasn't. It was buried, fragmented across different file categories separated by time and administrative classification, scattered through 3 separate commands in ways that would look like coincidence to anyone who wasn't looking specifically. But she was looking specifically. Training injury reports female soldiers, K9 unit, and adjacent units, showing a consistent spike during any month when Crowley held a training command position. Formal complaints that had been filed, and then administratively closed within 10 days without investigation, closed under notations like resolved informally and complainant withdrew. Performance evaluations on female NCOs who had transferred out of units where Crowley served evaluations that were technically within standards, but contained language that read carefully was designed to limit future assignment options. And names. 5 names across 3 years. 5 women who had filed a complaint, a request, a formal statement, and then gone quiet. 2 had separated from the Army. 1 had been transferred to a remote assignment in Alaska. 1's evaluation had been quietly adjusted to remove her from promotion eligibility. The 5th specialist, Alicia Torres, Military Intelligence, Fort Bragg, had submitted a formal EO complaint 18 months ago. The complaint had been closed in 9 days. Torres had been honorably discharged 8 weeks later. Lena sat with that information for a long time. Rex's breathing was slow and even against her leg. She thought about the morning conversation she'd overheard. She'll weigh that against whatever righteous indignation she's feeling right now, and she'll make the right call. Crowley believed she was operating from emotion. He believed her silence was the product of fear. Fear of losing retirement, eligibility. Fear of career damage. Fear of the machinery that had already quietly dismantled 5 women before her. That belief was his first serious mistake. Because Lena Vance was not operating from emotion. She was operating from something far more disciplined, and she was nowhere near done building what she needed. She reached out to Okafor the next morning through a personal text using a phrase they had agreed on in the clinic without ever explicitly agreeing on it, a kind of professional code that women who work in institutional environments develop naturally through necessity. Coffee before PT. It meant, I need to talk. Not officially, not on record. Now. They met in the parking area behind the dining facility. Okafor listened without speaking as Lena walked her through what she'd found. When Lena finished, Okafor was quiet for nearly a full minute. You found all of that in the unit administrative files, she said finally. What's in those files is the visible portion. What do you mean? I mean, someone with that kind of pattern, sustained, successful, never formally sanctioned, doesn't achieve that alone. There are people who reviewed those complaints and closed them. People who processed those transfers and signed those evaluations. Lena paused. I need to know who they are before I move. Okafor studied her. You've done this before. It wasn't a question. Done what? Built a case, under pressure, without institutional support. Lena held her gaze and said nothing. Okafor nodded slowly, as though an answer had been provided. What do you need from me? The medical records stay exactly where you put them. Separate file. Nothing gets moved or added. If anyone asks you about my visit, it was a routine training injury check. That's all. And if someone asks me directly, under orders, then you tell the truth. Lena met her eyes directly. Exactly the truth. Nothing more. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to wait. Okafor looked at her for a long moment. How long? I don't know yet. Another pause. Okay. Okafor straightened. I'll wait. 3 days passed. Crowley did not let them pass quietly. The first incident happened in the dining facility. Lena was eating alone. Rex positioned to her left under the table when Crowley walked in with 2 captains and deliberately chose the table directly beside her. He didn't speak to her immediately. He waited until she was almost finished eating. Then, loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "How's the arm, Sergeant?" She looked up. "Healing well, sir. Thank you for asking." Something flashed behind his eyes. "Good. Wouldn't want my demonstration to have caused any lasting inconvenience." "Not at all, sir. Because we can't have K9 handlers getting sidelined over training bumps. The unit needs you operational." He tilted his head slightly. "Assuming you decide to stay operational." The implied meaning was not subtle. File something, and your career ends. Stay quiet, and you stay in. Lena took a slow drink from her water bottle, set it down, and looked at him with an expression of complete professional neutrality. "I intend to stay operational for a long time, sir." The 2 captains beside him were very interested in their food. Crowley held her gaze for 3 seconds, then turned away. Under the table, Rex had gone very still. The second incident was more direct. 2 days later, Crowley appeared at the K9 unit's afternoon training session unannounced, which was unusual, and positioned himself at the edge of the training area, while Lena ran Rex through a detection protocol. She noticed him immediately. So did Rex. The dog completed every task with perfect precision, but his ear orientation shifted subtly during the final portion, tracking Crowley's position at the periphery with the specific continuous attention he reserved for persons his handler had identified as threats. After the session ended, Crowley approached. "Your dog has an attention problem," he said. "Kept looking at me instead of the task." "Rex was tracking a stimulus at the perimeter, sir. That's exactly what he's trained to do. A stimulus." He repeated the word with a slight smile. "Is that what I am?" In a training environment, everything outside the designated task area is a stimulus, sir. He stepped closer, close enough that the distance was deliberate inside professional space, just barely outside anything that could be formally reported. "I'm going to be very direct with you, Sergeant Vance." "I appreciate directness, sir. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever you think you've found or you're planning to file or whoever you think you're talking to, I want you to understand something." He kept his voice low, almost conversational. "I've been in this army for 22 years. I know how every system in it works. I know which complaints go where, who reads them, and how they get resolved. I know how careers end, and I know how to make sure a separation looks completely clean and routine." He paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Lena stood at attention. When she spoke, her voice was absolutely level. "I understand exactly what you're telling me, sir." "Good. I want to make sure you understand something as well, sir." He paused. "Go ahead." "Everything you just said to me, this conversation, this location, this time, has been recorded." The blood left his face so fast it was almost physical. Lena did not smile. "Standard safety protocol for handlers working with high-drive animals," she said calmly. "Audio and visual monitoring of all training sessions. Base Regulation 14-7. She held his gaze. "Is there anything else you'd like to address, sir?" He stared at her. Rex sat between them, looking up at Crowley with the patient, unblinking focus of an animal that has already decided. Crowley said nothing. He turned and walked away. Later that evening, alone in her quarters with Rex lying beside her and her laptop open, Lena allowed herself exactly one moment. One breath. One acknowledgement of what she felt beneath the controlled surface. The fear, the exhaustion, The weight of knowing that the machinery she was standing against had successfully swallowed 5 other women without leaving a mark. Then she closed that door and opened the case file. She had more work to do, because Major Nathan Crowley had just made his second serious mistake. He had confirmed without intending to that he knew she had been looking, which meant he was afraid. And afraid men make errors. She intended to be ready when the next one came. What Lena did not yet know, what no one on Fort Blackridge knew, was that she was not alone in what she had found. 1,400 miles away, in a civilian law office outside Washington, D.C., a woman named Alicia Torres was sitting across from a congressional investigator for the second time that month. And she was talking. She had been talking for 6 weeks. About Fort Bragg. About a complaint that had been filed and closed in 9 days. About an honorable discharge that had arrived 8 weeks later. About a pattern she had documented with the same quiet, methodical precision as a woman who had been trained to collect intelligence in environments where mistakes meant lives. Torres had been military intelligence. She knew exactly how to build a case, and she had been building one. The investigator leaned forward across the table. "You mentioned another name," he said. "Vance. Staff Sergeant Lena Vance. How do you know her?" Torres looked at the file in front of her. "I don't know her personally," she said. "But her name appeared in the same administrative trail as mine, 14 months ago when I started tracing the pattern backward." She paused. "If she's still at Blackridge." "She is." Torres was quiet for a moment. "Then someone needs to reach her before he does." The investigator reached for his phone. Rex was asleep against Lena's side when her personal cell buzzed at 22:47 hours. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. 3 years of classified operational work had given her a particular discipline about unknown numbers at night. The default was silence. But something made her pick up. "Is this Lena Vance?" The voice was female, precise. Someone accustomed to delivering information efficiently. "Who's asking?" "My name is not important right now. What's important is that I know what you found in those unit administrative files, and I know why you found it, and I know what he's planning to do about it." A pause. "What he's planning," Lena said carefully, "or what he already did." A brief silence on the other end. "You're further along than I thought." Something shifted in the voice, not quite admiration, but close to respect. "How long have you been building this? Since the day after the seminar?" Another pause. "You need to know something," the voice said. "You're not the only one. There are others. There's already an investigative thread outside the Army, outside the base. But it needs an anchor, someone who's currently inside, someone with documented evidence and standing." Lena was very still. Rex's breathing shifted slightly the way it did when he sensed tension in her body. "What are you asking me to do?" she said. "Nothing yet. I'm asking you to hold what you have. Don't file through internal channels. Not yet. Not through the unit. Not through the brigade. The complaint trail inside this base is compromised. We don't know how far up. And if he moves against me before then..." The pause that followed lasted long enough to mean something. "Trust your dog," the voice said. The line went dead. Lena held the phone for a moment. Then she set it down. Rex lifted his head and looked at her. She reached out and placed her hand against the side of his face, his jaw warm against her palm, his dark eyes steady and absolutely certain. "Okay," she said quietly. She wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. Maybe both. Trust your dog. She had learned that particular lesson a long time ago in places darker than Fort Blackridge had ever managed to be. She reached over and turned off the light. The file was still open on her laptop. Tomorrow she would add tonight's conversation to it, timestamp content, the exact phrasing of every sentence she could recall. But right now she closed her eyes. Rex pressed closer, and in the dark, Lena Vance breathed steadily and let herself be still. The case was building. She just had to make sure she was standing when it became visible. The question wasn't whether Nathan Crowley would move against her. The question was when, and what he would do when he found out she'd already been waiting for him. She didn't tell anyone about the phone call, not Okafor, not Davenport, not the nameless voice on the other end of the line who had known things she hadn't shared with a single living person on this base. She kept it inside the file, time-stamped word for word, and she kept moving, because the call had confirmed something she'd already suspected. Whatever was happening at Fort Blackridge was larger than one man and one pattern of disciplinary records. There were threads running outward from this place, and someone on the outside was already pulling them. That meant the window between Crowley realizing she was building something, and Crowley deciding to act, was closing faster than she'd originally calculated. She needed to move without looking like she was moving. She was very good at that. Rex sensed the shift in her the morning after the call. He stayed tighter to her left side than usual during their morning run, his shoulder occasionally pressing against her calf, the dog's equivalent of checking in. She reached down twice without breaking stride and let her hand graze the top of his head. He didn't need more than that. Neither did she. They understood each other in the particular way that working pairs develop over years of shared silence and shared danger, a language built entirely from attention and trust, with no room in it for pretense. She trusted Rex more than she trusted most humans. Right now, that trust was the clearest thing in her life. The second morning after the phone call, Crowley made his move. She found out through Davenport. He appeared at the kennel before morning, feeding earlier than his shift required, and his face had the careful, controlled expression of someone carrying information they weren't sure how to deliver. "Sergeant Vance?" He glanced behind him. "I need to tell you something." "Then tell me." "Major Crowley spoke to Captain Merritt yesterday afternoon. I heard it. I wasn't supposed to. I was in the storage room adjacent, and the door wasn't fully closed." He paused. "He told Merritt he wants you reassigned. Said your performance metrics in the K-9 unit have shown a decline, and that your injury from the seminar is affecting your operational readiness." Lena looked at him steadily. "He said you should be evaluated for temporary limited duty, and that the evaluation should include a review of Rex's certification status." There it was. Rex's certification, not her career, her dog. She had expected Crowley to come at her. She had not fully calculated that he would understand correctly that the most effective way to dismantle her was not to threaten her directly. She had shown him. She didn't respond to direct threats, but to threaten the one thing on this base that she couldn't be coldly strategic about, the one thing she felt without filtering. "Who else heard that conversation?" she asked. "Just me, as far as I know." "You're going to need to write down exactly what you heard. Time, location, exact words as closely as you can remember. Don't use your personal email. Don't put it on the shared drive." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" Davenport was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. He was 22 years old, and she could see the weight of the choice moving behind his eyes, the calculation every junior soldier makes when they're asked to stand on the wrong side of a rank disparity. "Yeah," he said finally. "I can do that." "Thank you, Corporal." He nodded and started to leave. Then he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around. "Rex's numbers are perfect. Every metric. His recertification scores from last month are the highest in the unit." He paused. "Anyone who says otherwise is lying." He left before she could respond. She stood still for a moment. Then she went to feed Rex. The dog ate with total focus the way he did everything, and she watched him and thought about what Crowley had just revealed about himself without meaning to. He was scared. Scared men targeted what you loved, because they needed you destabilized. They needed you emotional and reactive and focused on protecting something rather than building something. He was trying to pull her attention away from the case file. She was not going to let that happen. But she also needed to move faster. She spent that afternoon making contact with someone she hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. Warrant Officer Sandra Reyes had been Lena's direct counterpart in Syria during the classified counter-terror cycle. a military intelligence analyst with a gift for reading institutional behavior that bordered on uncanny. She had separated from the Army 14 months ago and was now working as a private defense contractor, doing exactly the kind of cross-referencing analysis that Lena needed and couldn't do alone. She texted her through a secure app she'd kept on her phone out of professional habit, using a contact name listed only by initials. Need eyes on something. Historical. Administrative. Involves a pattern across multiple installations. Confidential until I say otherwise. The response came back in 11 minutes. Send me what you have. I'll look tonight. Lena encrypted the relevant portions of her file, the names, the dates, the closed complaint numbers, the transfer records, and sent them. Then she waited. She didn't sleep much again that night. Rex didn't leave her side. At 0340 hours, her phone lit up. A single message from Reyes. Call me, now. She stepped outside and dialed. Reyes answered on the first ring, and her voice had none of the casual warmth of someone who'd been pulled from sleep. She sounded like she'd been awake for hours. Lena, I need you to understand something before I tell you what I found. I'm listening. What you sent me, the names, the file numbers, the dates, I cross-referenced them against DoD administrative databases I have legitimate access to through my current contract. A pause. The pattern doesn't stop at Black Ridge. Lena felt something cold settle in her chest. How far does it go? I've confirmed parallel administrative signatures at 3 additional installations. Fort Campbell, Schofield Barracks, Camp Humphreys, Korea. Reyes's voice was steady and deliberate. Each location matches the timeline of Crowley's previous assignments. And in each location, there's the same profile: complaints filed, complaints closed, women transferred or separated. But here's what you don't have in your file, Lena. Tell me. The complaints weren't just closed. They were closed by the same reviewing authority at each installation. Different command structures, different JAG offices, different commanding officers. But the same signature on the administrative closeout documentation. She paused. Someone has been following him, protecting him, across every assignment, for at least 8 years. Lena stood completely still. The significance of what Reyes had just said was enormous. A single bad commander operating within a unit was a problem. A senior officer with systematic protection across multiple installations over nearly a decade was something else entirely. Something that implied cooperation at a level far above Crowley's rank. Do you know who? Lena asked. Not yet. The signature is a position title, not a name. Deputy Inspector General for Installation Management. But that office has had 3 different people in it over 8 years. Reyes paused again. I need more time to narrow it. How much time? A week. Maybe less if I can get into one more database without tripping a flag. I may not have a week. I know. That's why I called it 0340. Reyes's voice dropped slightly. Lena, what's your exposure right now? Does he know you're building this? She thought about the conversation at the K-9 training area. She thought about the word recorded and the way all the blood had left Crowley's face. He suspects, she said. He doesn't know how much. Then he's going to move soon. Scared men with institutional protection always move fast when they feel cornered. They don't calculate anymore, they just act. A beat. You need to be ready for him to do something that doesn't follow procedure. I've been ready for that since day one. Good. A pause. One more thing. The name Torres Alicia Torres Fort Bragg. She's in your file. She is. She's talking to someone. I can't confirm who yet. But there's congressional activity in that direction. A legislative aids office has been pulling Army Equal Opportunity administrative records under a routine oversight request. That's not random. Someone is already asking questions at that level. Lena absorbed that. It matched what the unknown caller had told her 2 nights ago. The threads were converging. She just needed them to hold long enough. Keep going, she told Reyes. Whatever you can find, send it through the same channel. Watch yourself, Reyes said, and watch your dog. The line went quiet. Lena went back inside. Rex was sitting by the door, watching it the way he did when he'd been tracking her absence. He stood when she came in and pushed his head against her hand. "I know," she said softly. She sat down and opened her laptop and stared at the case file growing now pages deep, cross-referenced and time-stamped, and built with the same methodical care she had applied to intelligence work in environments where a missed detail could cost someone their life. She thought about what Reyes had said. Scared men with institutional protection always move fast when they feel cornered. She had cornered him at the training area. She had let him see the recording reference deliberately. She had needed him to know she was armed. She had needed him off balance. But she had also accelerated his timeline. That was a calculated risk she had accepted in the moment. Now she had to manage the consequences. She thought about Rex's certification status, about what Davenport had overheard. Crowley was going to try to remove Rex from the equation, pull the dog's operational standing, separate them. Because he had understood correctly that Rex was not just her partner, Rex was evidence. The dog's reaction at the seminar had been witnessed by 300 people. The dog's presence at the training area confrontation had been witnessed by Crowley himself. Rex wearing a body harness with recording capability was documentation Crowley couldn't explain away or administratively redirect. He needed the dog gone. She wasn't going to let that happen. The next morning, she did something she had been considering for 72 hours and had not yet committed to. She drove off base on her lunch break, alone. No Rex. A personal vehicle, civilian clothes, nothing connecting her to the military, except the invisible discipline in the way she moved. She walked into a UPS store 12 miles from the main gate and sent a sealed envelope, a physical copy, not digital, to an address she had memorized rather than written down. The address was in Washington, D.C. The recipient was a congressional oversight staffer whose name she had found through a combination of public records and professional inference, working backward from the legislative aid activity that Reyes had mentioned. Inside the envelope was a summary. 4 pages. No names except Crowley's. Dates, file numbers, cross-referenced complaint records, medical documentation, and a single sentence at the bottom of the 4th page. I am currently active duty on base and building the full case. I need 30 days and a protected channel. If you are already looking at this, you know how to reach me. She drove back to base. She did not tell anyone what she had sent. She told herself it was insurance. Then she went back to work. 2 days later, Crowley showed up at the commanding officer's weekly briefing and brought a performance concern package with him. Lena learned about it from the senior NCO who had been present. Master Sergeant Gerald Park, a 30-year man who had watched enough institutional politics to know the smell of them. He found her after the briefing in the hallway outside the Unit Operations Center and pulled her aside with the particular expression of a senior NCO delivering information he wishes were not his to deliver. He put your name in front of Colonel Hargrove, Park said quietly. Operational readiness concern. Injury from the combative seminar affecting your capacity to handle your animal safely. He recommended a 30-day limited duty assessment. What did the colonel say? He said he'd take it under advisement. Park paused. Which means nothing has been decided but the seed is planted. He studied her face carefully. Sergeant Vance, I've been in this army since before you graduated high school. I've seen this exact move exactly 4 times in 30 years, and every time I've seen it, there's a reason behind it that has nothing to do with the performance concern on the paperwork. She looked at him steadily. I appreciate you telling me, Master Sergeant. Is there something I should know? A long pause. Not yet, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. I've got 3 years until I retire, he said carefully. I've spent 30 years doing things the right way in this army. If someone is doing things the wrong way systematically over time to people who can't fight back without losing everything I would want to know about it before I put in my retirement paperwork. He paused. That's all I'm saying. He walked away. Lena stood in the hallway alone for 30 seconds. Then she went to find Rex. The dog met her at the kennel gate with the same unhurried certainty he always brought, tail moving in a slow, steady arc, eyes fixed on her face, reading her the way only he could. She clipped his lead, and they walked. She needed to think. The performance concern package changed her timeline. If Crowley succeeded in getting a limited duty assessment, initiated the process, would pull Rex into administrative review, not a formal decertification, but a bureaucratic gray zone, where his status would be ambiguous enough that she'd lose operational authority over his assignments. It was a move designed to separate them without the optics of doing so directly. He was smart. She had to give him that. He was dismantling her carefully, methodically. The same way the pattern in those files had been built not with one dramatic action, but with accumulated small administrative moves that each looked reasonable in isolation and only revealed their purpose when you saw them together. She was watching him run the same playbook he'd run 8 years running, and she was the only person on this base who could see the whole board. The problem was that knowing wasn't enough. She needed to stop it, not survive it. Stop it before he did to her what had been done to Torres, to the medic from Germany, to the intelligence officer from Korea. She needed something that made moving against her cost more than protecting himself. She thought about that for a long time, walking with Rex through the afternoon heat, the dog's breathing steady beside her. She thought about what Reyes had said. Someone has been following him, protecting him, across every assignment, for 8 years. That was the piece she was missing. She didn't need just Crowley's file. She needed the name of whoever had been signing those administrative closeouts, because that person, whoever they were, was the architecture that made everything else possible. Remove the protection, and Crowley was just a major with a pattern. The pattern becomes visible. The pattern becomes prosecutable. Without the protection, he's exposed. With it, he's untouchable. She needed Reyes to find that name. She pulled out her phone and sent one message. "How close are you?" The response came back in 4 minutes. "Closer. Give me 48 hours." She put her phone away. 48 hours. She could hold 48 hours. She had held longer in worse circumstances. She brought Rex back to the kennel, ran him through a brief maintenance drill, more for his benefit than hers, giving him structured work because he needed it, and because the routine grounded her. And then she sat on the bench outside his enclosure and did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She called her sister, not to talk about any of it, not to describe the case file or the phone calls or the envelope she'd sent to Washington or the performance concern package now sitting in the commanding officer's hands. Her sister was a school teacher in Virginia with 2 kids and no particular knowledge of how military institutions worked, and there was nothing she could do with the information. But she had a voice that sounded like home. And sometimes that was the only resource that mattered. "Hey, stranger," her sister said. "You actually called." "I had a minute. How's Rex?" Lena looked at the dog through the kennel fence. He was lying with his chin on his forepaws, watching her. "He's good," she said. "He's perfect." "And you?" A pause. "Working through something." Her sister didn't push. She never did. She had grown up with the same mother who had raised Lena, and she understood that working through something was as detailed as the report was going to get until the working through was done. "Okay," her sister said simply. "You know where I am?" "I know." "Rex going to be okay." Lena looked at the dog again. His dark eyes tracked her face through the fence with total attention. Calm. Certain. Completely without doubt about what he was or what he was supposed to do. "Yeah," she said. "He's going to be more than okay." She hung up and sat alone in the quiet for another moment. Then she pulled up the case file on her phone and started adding to it again. Park's account of the briefing. The timestamp, the exact language of the performance concern package as Park had described it. Every piece mattered. Every piece was another line Crowley had drawn that couldn't be erased. She was building something that didn't require her to be louder than him, or more powerful than him, or better connected than him. She was building something that simply required her to be more patient. And Lena Vance had patience in reserves that Nathan Crowley had no instrument to measure. On the 41st hour after she'd sent that message to Reyes, her phone buzzed. Not a text. A file transfer. 14 pages. She opened it. And for the first time since this began, her breath left her completely. The name at the bottom of every administrative closeout across 3 installations across 8 years was not a name she expected. It was not a deputy inspector general she could connect abstractly to Crowley's command history. It was Brigadier General Alan Mercer, Fort Blackridge's deputy commanding general, the man whose office was 2 buildings from where she was sitting, the man who had Crowley's complaint history in his hands because he had put it there, because he had been the one closing the complaints for 8 years. Because Nathan Crowley was not just protected by the institution, he was protected by a general. Lena sat with that information and felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she'd understood. This was not a single bad commander. This was a system, and she had just found its center. She looked at Rex through the fence. He stood up slowly, watching her face the way he always watched it when something significant had changed, reading the shift in her body, the quality of her stillness, the particular way she held herself when something had become real in a new way. His ears came fully forward. "I know," she said quietly. She stood up. She had work to do. And for the first time since the seminar, she wasn't just building a case. She was building a case against 2 men, one of whom had a star on his collar. And neither of them knew it yet. She sat with Reyes's 14 pages until 0200 hours. She read them the way she used to read intelligence reports in Syria, not once, not twice, but enough times that the information stopped being information and became structure. Pattern. Architecture. The skeleton of something too large to see whole until you stepped far enough back. Brigadier General Alan Mercer. Deputy Commanding General Fort Blackridge. The name appeared on administrative closeout documentation from Fort Campbell in 2016, from Schofield Barracks in 2018, from Camp Humphreys in 2020, and from Blackridge's own internal EO file in 2022, the Torres complaint closed in 9 days. Every single time, the documentation was formatted the same way. Every single time, the language used to justify closure was nearly identical. Insufficient corroborating evidence. Matter resolved through informal command action. No further investigation warranted. 8 years, 4 installations, 1 signature, and now Mercer was here, 2 buildings away, with 2 stars on his collar and a commanding officer above him who had no reason to believe his deputy was anything other than what his record claimed. Lena thought about what that meant operationally. It meant every internal channel on this base was potentially compromised. Not theoretically compromised, specifically, demonstrably, documentably compromised. Any complaint she filed through standard Army channels could reach Mercer's desk. Any formal report she submitted through the brigade could be intercepted, buried, or used against her before it cleared the installation. She had already known not to trust the internal process. The unknown caller had told her that. Her own research had confirmed it. But knowing Crowley had protection was different from knowing his protection wore a general's stars and worked 40 feet from the commanding officer. This was not a leak in the system. This was someone who had spent 8 years building a structure designed to make certain men immune to accountability. She was looking at something that required a response completely outside the base's authority structure. She needed the envelope she'd sent to Washington to land in the right hands before Crowley and Mercer realized the scope of what she'd built. She closed the laptop. Rex lifted his head from the cot. "Go back to sleep," she told him. He watched her for a moment, then lowered his head again, but he kept his eyes on her. He didn't actually sleep. He never did when she was awake and still and thinking the way she was thinking. She lay in the dark and constructed a decision tree the way her counter-terror training had taught her to, not emotionally, not morally, purely structurally. What could Crowley do next, and in what sequence, and what would each move cost him, and what would each of her responses cost her, and where did those branches converge into an outcome that either destroyed her or exposed him? The answer she kept arriving at was the same one. He was going to move physically, not administratively, not through paperwork and performance concerns. Those were delaying tactics, ways of softening the ground. But she had shown him she had recordings. She had shown him she wasn't afraid of his rank. She had shown him the administrative route wasn't going to produce the outcome he needed, which meant he was going to try something that couldn't be filed and processed and slow-walked through a bureaucratic machine. He was going to try to frighten her into walking away, and he was going to do it somewhere without witnesses. She had been waiting for that since day one. She was ready. She just needed Reyes's documents transferred to the right location before it happened. Once the material was outside the base and in the hands of someone with congressional reach, Crowley could do whatever he wanted to her career. The case would survive without her. She sent Reyes a final encrypted message at 0310. Everything you have, send copies outside your own system. 3 separate locations. Don't wait for me to tell you. Do it now. The response came back in 6 minutes. Already done. 2 hours ago. Are you safe? She thought about that question for a moment. Safe was relative. Safe enough, she typed back. She put the phone down and closed her eyes. She slept for 3 hours. Solid, dreamless, disciplined sleep, the kind you learn to take when you've operated in environments where rest is a resource you manage rather than a comfort you seek. She woke before her alarm-fed Rex ran him through his morning protocol and went to the administrative office to check her email. The performance concern package was already there. Colonel Hargrove had signed the limited duty assessment order at 0750 hours, effective immediately. She read the document carefully twice. It was clean, professional, completely free of anything overtly improper. It cited her injury, her recovery timeline, standard medical operational guidelines. There was nothing in the document that looked like what it was a coordinated move to separate her from Rex and pull her out of operational status before she could act. It looked like paperwork. That was the point. She walked to Master Sergeant Park's office. He was already at his desk when she knocked. He saw her face and pointed at the chair across from him without speaking. She sat. She put the document on his desk. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. "When did this come through?" he said. "This morning. It was signed at 0750. Park set the document down slowly. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man doing careful thinking. "Rex's certification records," he said. "His scores. Perfect across every metric. Davenport can confirm. And your injury. Partial ligament stress, healing on schedule. Okafor has the medical record." Park folded his hands on the desk. "Lena." He used her first name deliberately, a shift that told her he was speaking outside his rank now, not as a master sergeant to a staff sergeant, but as one soldier to another. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." "Ask. How bad is it?" She held his gaze. "Bad enough," she said, "that it goes above Crowley." The silence in the room was very complete. "How far above?" She said the name quietly. She watched Park absorb it the way a man absorbs physical impact, a slight backward movement, a stilling, a recalibration. He had been in the Army 30 years. He had worked around general officers his entire career. He understood without her explaining it exactly what that name in that context meant. "Lord," he said softly, not dramatically. Just the word breathed out like a man setting down something very heavy. "I need you to do something for me," Lena said. "I need you to do it today, and I need it done outside any system connected to this base." "Tell me." Davenport's written account of the conversation he overheard. Your own account of the briefing where Crowley raised the performance concern. Physical copies, not digital. Sent to a personal address. I'm going to give you off base from a post office that isn't on installation. Park didn't move for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out a notepad, and slid it across the desk. "Write it down," he said. She wrote the address, the same Washington address she'd used for the envelope memorized, never recorded anywhere digital. When? He said. Today. Before end of business. He looked at the address on the notepad. He looked at her. You understand, he said carefully, that if this goes the way you're suggesting it might go, if the name you just said to me is actually in this, your career here is done regardless of the outcome. Even if you're right. Even if every piece of your case holds. I know. And Rex. She paused for just a fraction of a second. Rex is not going to be touched, she said. That's not negotiable. Park nodded once. He folded the notepad and put it in his jacket pocket. End of business, he said. She stood. Thank you, Master Sergeant. Don't thank me. He picked up his pen and looked back at his desk. Just be right. She left his office and walked directly to the kennel. Rex heard her coming before she reached the gate. He was already at the fence tail moving when she arrived. She unlatched the gate and he came through to her side in one clean movement, pressing his shoulder against her leg. She clipped his working harness, the one with the body camera integrated into the chest panel. She had been keeping it charged and active for 9 days. She checked the battery. Full. She checked the recording indicator. Green. Let's go, she said. They walked together into the late morning. She didn't know yet that Crowley had already decided. She found out 40 minutes later. Davenport appeared at the south end of the training field where she was running Rex through a tracking exercise. He was moving faster than his normal pace, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of someone who has heard something they wish they hadn't. Sergeant Vance. He stopped when he reached her. He was breathing a little harder than the walk warranted. I just came from the motor pool. I was returning equipment. And I heard Major Crowley on his phone. He hesitated. I shouldn't have been close enough to hear it, but the side door was open, and I was passing, and... What did he say? Davenport swallowed. He said, and I'm going to try to give you the exact words he said. Tell Morrison and Garrett to be there at 2100, behind the motor pool. She'll come if I make her think she has no other choice. We finish this tonight, and she walks away with nothing, or she doesn't walk away at all. The words landed like a dropped weight. Lena stood absolutely still. Rex stopped tracking and turned to her, reading the change in her body with immediate precision. She doesn't walk away at all. The language was ambiguous enough to be legally deniable. It was also unambiguous enough in context that Davenport had run to find her. You're sure of those words? She said. I'm sure. Morrison and Garrett. You know those names. Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Garrett, both assigned to Crowley's staff. She thought for exactly 3 seconds. Go write it down, she said. Same as before. Exact time, exact words, exact location. Don't talk to anyone. Go directly to your quarters and do it now. Sergeant Vance, you're not actually going to go, are you? She looked at him. She saw the fear in his face. Genuine fear. The kind that comes from a young person realizing the situation they're standing in is far more dangerous than it looked an hour ago. Go write it down, she said again, gently this time. He went. She stood on the training field alone with Rex and thought about 2,100 hours. She thought about the word trap. She had identified Crowley as a man who performed dominance in front of witnesses. She had identified him as a man who protected his position through institutional machinery rather than direct confrontation. She had identified him as someone whose pattern over 8 years had been administrative, careful, documented, slow, systematic. What Davenport had just described was none of those things. This was a man who felt the walls closing and had abandoned his own playbook. That made him more dangerous, and it also made him reckless. Reckless men make evidence. She called Okafor. I need to see you, not the clinic. Somewhere else, right now. 20 minutes later, they stood in the parking area behind the PX, and Lena told her everything. Not the full file, not the 14 pages from Reyes, not the name she had said to Park, but the operational reality of tonight. 2,100 hours. The motor pool. 3 men. The specific words Davenport had heard. Okafor's face went through several things rapidly, and then settled into something hard and decided. "You're going," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going. Lena. If I don't go, he escalates through another channel. The performance assessment pulls Rex into review. He files something else. He finds another lever." She met Okafor's eyes directly. "If I go, and I go prepared, and he does what he's planning to do, it's the last move he ever makes." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be in the administration building at 2050. I need you to have your personal phone active with video recording capability and an open line to my number." She paused. "And I need you to call military police at 2100, regardless of what you hear or don't hear. And if something goes wrong before they arrive..." Lena looked at Rex, sitting calmly at her feet. "Something will go very wrong for them," she said, "before they arrive." She spent the remaining hours of the afternoon with focused, quiet preparation. She tested Rex's harness camera twice. She identified the security camera positions around the motor pool and mapped the angles the known cameras Crowley would have identified, and the auxiliary equipment camera on the east-facing wall of the adjacent maintenance bay that most people forgot was there because it was mounted to monitor vehicle access and pointed slightly away from the main area. Not directly on the target position, but close enough. She checked the emergency signal on her personal locator, a device she carried out of operational habit, something she'd kept from her counter-terror deployment, and had never stopped wearing on the inner band of her watch strap. She ate dinner. She ran Rex through a short maintenance session. She sat with him in the kennel and spoke to him quietly, not the commands she used during work, but the low, even voice she used when it was just the two of them, and the night was quiet. "We've done harder things," she told him. He sat with his chin on her knee and looked up at her with those dark, certain eyes. "You know what to do," she said. "You always know." His tail moved once, slow and steady. At 2045, she put on Rex's working harness. At 2050, she confirmed Okafor's position. At 2055, she started walking. The motor pool was dark, except for the security lighting at the main vehicle entrance. She came in from the east, which kept her in the shadow line of the maintenance bay, and put the auxiliary camera at her back, recording her approach, recording the target area ahead, capturing everything. She felt Rex's shoulder against her left thigh as she walked. His head was up, ears fully forward. He already knew. She saw Crowley before he saw her. He was standing at the rear of the motor pool with Morrison on his left and Garrett on his right. Morrison was large, 6'2" former infantry built for intimidation. Garrett was smaller, but standing with the particular tension of someone who had committed to something and was holding the commitment in his body like a coiled spring. 3 men, 1 dog, and Lena Vance, who had operated in environments these 3 had never imagined, standing in the dark with 8 days of evidence secured. A congressional contact alerted a general's name in sealed envelopes outside this installation, and a military working dog who had already decided. She stopped 12 feet away. "Sergeant Vance?" Crowley's voice was different from his usual performance register. Quieter. Stripped of the audience-facing confidence. This was the voice he used when there was no crowd to manage. "I'm glad you came. You didn't give me much choice, sir." "No, I didn't." He stepped forward. "Here's what happens now. You're going to tell me everything you've filed, everyone you've spoken to, and then you're going to sign a voluntary withdrawal of any informal complaints or concerns you've raised through any channel. And then this is over. And if I don't..." He moved another step forward. "Then your dog loses his certification for unpredictable behavior. You're placed on extended limited duty. And you leave this army in 18 months with a record that makes finding civilian employment a significant challenge." His voice was absolutely flat. "I have done this before. You know I have. Every woman who sat where you're sitting eventually made the right choice." Rex made a sound, not a bark, not a growl. Something lower. Something that started in his chest and moved through the air between them like a current. Crowley looked at the dog. "Control your animal." "Rex is controlled," Lena said. "He's doing exactly what he's trained to do." I told you to. He's detecting elevated aggression, abnormal stress indicators, and threat posture behavior in the individuals present. She held Crowley's gaze without blinking. He's a combat-trained military working dog. That's his job. I can't override his training any more than you can override yours. Crowley's jaw tightened. He nodded at Morrison. Morrison stepped forward and reached for Lena's arm. And that was the last controlled decision anyone made for the next 8 seconds. Rex launched, not from excitement, not from panic. From complete focused, trained purpose, 2 years of certification, and 6 deployments compressed into a single movement as the Belgian Malinois came off the ground with 160 pounds of forward momentum and hit Morrison in the center of his chest. The impact was total. Morrison went backward and down like something structural had been removed from beneath him, and Rex was on him before he stopped moving, not biting, not tearing, but pinning and controlling with the precise application of force that differentiated a combat dog from an attack animal. Morrison could not move without Rex allowing it. He did not allow it. Garrett lunged toward Lena from the right. She let him come. He reached for her shoulder, and she moved not backward inward, redirecting his momentum with her left forearm and rotating her body into his center of gravity in one clean motion that put him face down on the pavement before he fully registered what had happened. Her right arm screamed from the lingering ligament damage. She pressed through it without slowing. Garrett lay flat. She stepped back. Rex turned. Crowley had not moved. He was standing exactly where he had been standing, looking at 2 of his officers on the ground, and looking at Lena standing between them and him, and looking at the Belgian Malinois, who had now positioned himself directly between Crowley and Lena, with his full attention fixed and his teeth showing just enough to be a statement rather than a threat. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. 5. No shouting. No chaos. No one scrambling. Just the specific absolute silence of men who had entered a situation believing they controlled it and had discovered in under 10 seconds that they did not. Crowley's face went through several things rapidly. Anger. Calculation. Something that was almost not quite fear. "You have assaulted superior officers," he said. His voice was still controlled, but it had lost something fundamental. "This is over for you." "The body camera on Rex's harness has been recording since I left the kennel," Lena said. "The auxiliary equipment camera on the east wall of the maintenance bay has been recording since I entered the motor pool. Sergeant First Class Okafor is in the administration building with an open phone line that has captured this conversation in its entirety. Military police were called at 2100 hours and are currently en route." She paused. "And Major Crowley, I want to make sure you understand something very clearly before they arrive." He stared at her. "I know about General Mercer," she said. "I know about Fort Campbell. I know about Schofield Barracks. I know about Camp Humphreys. I know about Alicia Torres and the 9 days it took to close her complaint. I know about every woman in every unit across every installation." Her voice was steady and quiet and carried no heat whatsoever. "All of it is already outside this base. It's already in Washington. And the only question left is how many people this takes down with you." The blood left Nathan Crowley's face, not gradually, at once, like a light going out. Behind him, Morrison had stopped moving entirely. Garrett had not gotten up from the pavement. The night was very still and very clear, and somewhere in the distance the sound of a vehicle approaching the motor pool gate was becoming audible. Military police. Rex sat. He positioned himself exactly beside Lena's left knee, facing Crowley in the clean, formal posture of an animal that has completed its task and is now waiting for the next instruction. Crowley looked at the dog. Then he looked at Lena. And for the first time in 22 years, Nathan Crowley had absolutely nothing to say. The gate opened, the lights came in, and the night at Fort Blackridge changed completely. The first military police sergeant through the gate was a woman named Specialist Carla Trent, 26 years old, 4 years in the Army, and she had responded to enough late-night calls in the motor pool area to know that what she was walking into was not a standard disturbance. She saw Morrison on the ground. She saw Garrett getting slowly to his feet. She saw Crowley standing motionless with an expression she had no prior reference for on a field-grade officer. And she saw Staff Sergeant Lena Vance standing straight-backed and composed with a Belgian Malinois sitting at her knee like a comma at the end of a sentence. Trent's hand went to her radio. "I need a second unit at Motorpool Rear, now." The second vehicle arrived in under 4 minutes. By the time the senior MP on scene, Staff Sergeant Howard Cole had assessed the situation and begun separating principals. Lena had already done 3 things. She had calmly identified herself, her unit, and her K-9. She had stated clearly, and for the recording, that she had been summoned to this location under duress, that the individuals present had initiated physical contact, and that her military working dog had responded to protect her in accordance with his training. And she had handed Cole a folded piece of paper she had been carrying in her left jacket pocket for 6 hours. Cole unfolded it and read it. It was a single paragraph typed and time-stamped that named the location, the time the individuals expected to be present, and the nature of the threat Davenport had overheard. It had been prepared before she left the kennel. It was dated and signed. Cole looked at her over the paper. "You wrote this before you came here," he said. "At 1940 hours, yes." He looked at the paper again. He looked at Crowley. Something shifted behind his eyes. The particular shift that happens when a person realizes they are standing at the edge of something much larger than the call they were dispatched to. "Nobody leaves," he said to no one in particular. Then he keyed his radio again. Crowley found his voice in that moment. "Sergeant Cole?" His tone had recovered some of its authority, not all of it, but enough. "This woman and her animal assaulted 2 officers. That is what happened here tonight. I want her detained and that dog secured immediately." Cole looked at him steadily. "Sir, I'm going to need everyone to remain where they are while I assess the situation." "I am a major. I am giving you a direct order, sir." Cole's voice was absolutely respectful and absolutely immovable. "I am conducting an active assessment of a scene involving injuries and alleged physical altercation. Until I complete that assessment, my orders come from my chain of command. I'd ask you to please remain where you are." The silence that followed had a particular quality. Crowley recognized it. It was the silence of institutional ground, shifting under his feet in real time. Lena said nothing. She stood still and let it happen. Morrison was on his feet, now rotating his shoulder carefully, his face carrying the specific expression of a man recalculating the decision he had made 2 hours ago. Garrett stood beside him and said nothing at all. He had said nothing since he'd gotten up from the pavement, and Lena suspected he was already doing the arithmetic rank versus exposure loyalty versus self-preservation, and arriving at an answer Crowley wasn't going to like. Cole stepped away from the group and made a call she couldn't hear. When he came back, his expression had changed. "Major Crowley," he said, "I've been directed to ask you and the 2 officers with you to accompany me to the MP station for a statement. Staff Sergeant Vance, you as well." He paused. "The Criminal Investigation Division has been notified. CID, not the MP duty desk, not the brigade staff duty officer. The Criminal Investigation Division." Someone Cole had called had made a decision quickly about what level of response this situation required. Crowley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lena kept her face exactly neutral. But something in her chest, something she had been holding compressed for 12 days, released about 1 degree. Not relief. Not yet. Something smaller than that. The first confirmation that the ground she had built was solid enough to stand on. She reached down and touched Rex's head once. He leaned slightly into her hand. They followed Cole to the vehicles. The night was just beginning. The CID agent who interviewed her was a warrant officer named Kessler, mid-40s, civilian clothes, the particular economy of movement that came from years of questioning people who were either lying or terrified, or both. He sat across a small table from her in a room that smelled like institutional coffee and fluorescent lighting, and he had a yellow legal pad in front of him that he had not yet written anything on. He looked at her for a moment. "You want to tell me what happened tonight?" "I want to tell you what happened 12 days ago," she said. Tonight is chapter 12. You need chapters 1 through 11 first. Kessler looked at her. He picked up his pen. Start wherever you need to, he said. She talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She laid out every piece in sequence: the combative seminar, the medical documentation, Davenport's account, the administrative records. She'd reviewed the pattern across 4 installations, the performance concern package, the limited duty order, the conversation she'd overheard through the administration building window, and the phone call at 22:47 hours that had confirmed external investigative activity was already in motion. She did not yet say Mercer's name. She kept Reyes's 14 pages in reserve. Not because she was uncertain about them, because she had learned from operational experience that you don't lay every card on the table in the first meeting. You lay enough to establish credibility enough to move the investigation forward, and you keep your deepest evidence for the moment when the other side thinks they have regained control. Kessler listened without interrupting. He wrote steadily the entire time. When she finished, he sat back and looked at what he'd written for a long moment. The recording from tonight, he said. Rex's harness camera. Battery is full. Continuous recording from 2045 hours. I can provide the device now if you want to initiate evidence custody. I do. He paused. The external file you mentioned. The Washington contact. If the investigation progresses appropriately, that contact will reach you directly. I won't be the intermediary. Kessler tilted his head slightly. You set this up so you didn't have to be. I set it up so the evidence survives regardless of what happens to me. He studied her for a moment. You thought he might actually... I thought he had done it before. To 5 women across 3 installations. She held his gaze. I wasn't going to be number 6. Kessler looked at his legal pad. He looked at her. I'm going to need the names, he said quietly. The other women. They're in the file. I'll give you what I have. Some of them may be willing to talk now. One of them is already talking to someone in Washington. You may find that thread reaches you before the week is out. He nodded slowly. One more question. He set down his pen. The general. She looked at him. She had not said that word in this room. What general? She said carefully. Kessler was quiet for a moment. We're going to need to have a longer conversation, he said, than the one we just had. She felt the floor shift very slightly under everything she thought she understood about where this was going. Have you already? She started. I've been working a parallel inquiry, Kessler said, for 6 weeks. Different starting point, different installation, same signature on the administrative closeout documentation. He held her gaze steadily. We've been looking at this from 2 ends. I think you just gave me the middle. The silence in the room lasted 5 full seconds. Then Lena Vance, who had been cold and disciplined and controlled for 12 consecutive days, allowed herself one breath that was something other than tactical. You already knew, she said. We suspected. We didn't have the administrative trail you built. He paused. Where did you learn to do that? Syria, she said. You learn to build cases in environments where there's no institutional support. You learn to be the institution yourself. Kessler looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. I need to make a phone call, he said. Stay here. He left the room. Rex was in an adjacent kennel space. She had confirmed his location before sitting down, and she sat alone in the interview room and let herself think about what Kessler had just told her. 6 weeks. A parallel inquiry. A different starting point. The Torres complaint. It had to be. Torres talking to the congressional investigator had generated enough institutional attention that CID had been quietly activated, not through the standard base reporting chain, which was compromised, but through a separate channel she couldn't identify yet. 2 investigations. Same target. 6 weeks of parallel work that neither side knew about, and she had just walked into the CID office and handed them the connective tissue. She thought about the unknown caller from 11 days ago. There's already an investigative thread outside the Army, outside the base. That caller had known CID was moving. which meant the caller was either inside CID or adjacent to it. She filed that thought for later. Kessler came back 18 minutes later. He sat down and looked at her with an expression that was more open than before the specific opening of a man who has received information that has upgraded his assessment of the person across from him. I need you to authorize a consent search of your personal device and your personal file. Everything you've built. You'll have it. And I need Reyes. Her face gave nothing. Warrant Officer Kessler, Sandra Reyes, former military intelligence, currently private defense contracting. She cross-referenced administrative databases 14 days ago using legitimate contract access. He paused. We know about the document transfer. Lena held very still. Is she in trouble? She asked. No. He paused. She's actually the reason I'm having this conversation with you at 11:30 at night, instead of processing a standard incident report. The file she sent us filled in 3 years of gaps. He tilted his head slightly. She sent it to us 4 days ago, anonymously, except the metadata wasn't fully scrubbed. 4 days ago, before the motor pool, before tonight. Reyes had been feeding both sides simultaneously. Lena almost smiled. I'll contact her, she said. Kessler nodded. One more thing. He looked at his notes briefly. Tonight, the altercation. Crowley is already constructing a narrative. Assault on superior officers. Unauthorized release of a military working dog in a non-operational environment. He paused. Morrison is backing him. Garrett is not speaking yet. Garrett will break, Lena said. He's a lieutenant, not a loyalist. He followed Crowley because Crowley outranked him. The moment Garrett's lawyer explains what accessory to criminal intimidation looks like on a permanent record, he'll make the right decision. And if he doesn't, the harness camera will answer every question before Garrett has to. Kessler looked at her steadily. You think of everything, he said. I've had to, she said simply. She was held for 2 more hours for formal documentation. She surrendered Rex's harness camera, signed the consent forms for her personal files, and provided Reyes's contact information through a method Kessler authorized. At 01:45 hours, she was released. Rex was brought to her at the MP station entrance leash in the hands of a young private who looked slightly uncertain about how to return a dog that had put a captain on the ground 90 minutes earlier. Rex walked directly to Lena's left side and pressed against her leg without dramatics. The private handed over the lead. He was fine, the private said, with the specific tone of someone who had been slightly afraid and was now relieved. Really calm. Just sat there and watched the door. That's what he does, Lena said. She walked out into the night with Rex and stood still for a moment, breathing air that felt different from the recycled institutional air inside. She was exhausted. 12 days of sustained high-function pressure was a weight she had been carrying with complete control, and standing here on the other side of the night's confrontation, she felt it settle into her body all at once. Her arm throbbing, her legs heavier than they'd been at 2100 hours, her mind processing the full scope of what the last 4 hours had produced. She pulled out her phone. She called Okafor. It's me. I heard the MP vehicles. Okafor's voice was tight with controlled worry. Are you okay? I'm okay. Rex is fine. Crowley. CID has everyone. There's a parallel investigation we didn't know about. It's bigger than Blackridge. She paused. I think it's actually happening. A long silence. Lord, Okafor said softly. I know. What do you need right now? Lena looked at Rex, sitting patiently at her feet in the dark, his eyes on her face, waiting. I need to sleep, she said, for about 8 hours. And then I need to be ready for whatever comes next. Get some sleep, Okafor said. I'll be here. The morning arrived faster than she expected. By 0800 hours, 3 things had happened that she hadn't anticipated. The first was that Garrett had requested his own legal counsel at 0630 and had asked to make a voluntary statement. The second was that the envelope she had sent to Washington had generated a response not through the address she had used, but through Kessler's office, which told her the congressional contact had been legitimate, and the thread was moving faster than she'd planned. The third was the one she hadn't seen coming at all. Master Sergeant Park appeared at the kennel at 0740 earlier than any reasonable duty requirement explained, and his face carried the particular weight of a man who has spent the night doing something that cost him something real. "I made some calls last night," he said. "Park, after I sent the package to Washington, I made some calls." He sat down on the bench outside Rex's enclosure. Rex watched him with relaxed attention, tail resting still. "There are two women I've known for years. Both separated. Both left under circumstances I never questioned enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have questioned them." Lena sat across from him. "Who are they?" "Captain Dana Rice, left Fort Campbell in 2018. Medical administrative separation described as voluntary." He looked at his hands. "And Sergeant First Class Pamela Cho, Intelligence Unit Schofield Barracks. Transferred to Alaska in 2019 on a hardship assignment she apparently requested. Except Pamela Cho's family is from Hawaii. She had no reason to request Alaska." He paused. "I've known Pam since we were both E4s. I never put it together." Lena was quiet. "Did you reach them?" "Race is willing to talk to CID. She's been waiting," he said, and his voice had something rough and painful in it, for someone to ask. He looked up at her. "She told me she filed a complaint in 2017. She said the complaint was closed in 11 days, and 3 weeks later, she was counseled for performance issues that had never appeared in any prior evaluation." He stopped. "She was one of the best officers I ever worked with." Lena let the silence hold for a moment. "And Cho, she's thinking about it. She has a family now, 2 kids. She's worried about—" He stopped. "She's worried about what it costs her to say it out loud officially even now." "That's legitimate," Lena said. "She doesn't have to do anything she's not ready for." "I told her that." Park looked at the ground. "I also told her there are others, that she's not alone in it, that someone built a case." He paused. "I hope that was okay." "It was more than okay." He nodded slowly. "The other thing," he said, "about Mercer." Lena looked at him carefully. "CID came to me this morning, before I came here. They're pulling his administrative records across 4 installations." Park's voice was very even. "He's been placed on administrative hold pending review of his official duties, as of 700 hours this morning." The air went out of the space between them. Administrative hold on a general officer. That was not a routine action. That was not precautionary paperwork. That was an institution beginning to move against one of its own at a level that required sign-off far above any local command. "Who authorized that?" Lena asked. "The language I heard was Department of the Army level." Park paused. "Someone in Washington pushed a button last night." The envelope, or Torres, or Kessler's parallel inquiry finally reaching critical mass, or all 3 at once converging in the same 8-hour window and producing enough institutional momentum that someone above Mercer's pay grade had decided the exposure cost of protecting him was now greater than the cost of removing him. Lena sat very still and felt the weight of that shift. 8 years of protection, 4 installations, 5 women destroyed quietly, and now a general on administrative hold before 800 hours on a Thursday morning. She looked at Rex. He was watching her with that unwavering attention, the calm, absolute certain presence he always brought. She thought about what it had taken to get here. 12 days. Barely any sleep. A ligament that still throbbed when the temperature dropped. A case file built in secret on a base where the institutional machinery had been weaponized against her. 300 witnesses who had watched a major twist her arm in public and said nothing. She thought about Rice. About Cho. About Torres talking to congressional investigators 1,400 miles away. About 5 women scattered across 3 time zones who had each made the same calculation. Crowley had assumed Lena would make the calculation between career survival and speaking, and had each alone, without knowing about any of the others, decided that silence was the price of staying. She thought about how long that silence had lasted, and she felt something move through her that was not triumph. It was too heavy for triumph, but was something adjacent to it. Something that came from knowing the silence was ending, and that the ending had cost exactly what it had been going to cost all along, and she had paid it, and it had been worth it. "Park," she said. He looked up. "Race and Cho. Whatever they decide, make sure they know there's no pressure. From me or anyone connected to me." She paused. "They've already done something by surviving. They don't owe this case anything else." Park looked at her for a long moment. "You know," he said quietly, 30 years in this army, I thought I'd seen the best and the worst of what people are capable of." He stood up slowly. "I think I underestimated both." He left without further explanation. She sat alone with Rex and let the morning settle. The investigation was moving. The protection had been pulled. And somewhere in a congressional office in Washington, a thread that had been carefully, quietly pulled for 6 weeks was finally unraveling the full length of what it was attached to. But she knew better than to believe it was over. Because Crowley was still talking, and men who had operated with impunity for 8 years didn't stop talking just because the ground had moved. He was going to try to reframe everything that had happened. Tonight, yesterday, 12 days ago. He was going to put a different story on top of hers and see which one the institution chose to believe. She had evidence. He had rank and history and 22 years of relationships built inside the system she was fighting. It wasn't over. She stood up, clipped Rex's lead, and started walking. There was still work to do, and Lena Vance had never in her life stopped working just because the hardest part was behind her. She knew with the certainty of someone who had built things under fire before that the hardest part was almost certainly still ahead. She was right about Crowley. He didn't stop talking. Within 48 hours of the motor pool incident, his legal counsel had drafted and submitted a formal counter-complaint, 11 pages precisely formatted, alleging that Staff Sergeant Lena Vance had weaponized a military working dog against superior officers in an unauthorized operational context, that her conduct represented a pattern of insubordination and escalating instability, and that the so-called evidence she had submitted to CYD was the product of illegal access to administrative files beyond her authorization level. It was a good document. Whoever had written it understood exactly how these proceedings worked, how to frame an aggressor as a victim, how to make a pattern of abuse look like a pattern of legitimate command action, how to take 12 days of careful evidence building and recast it as a vendetta. Lena read it once. Then she set it down and went to feed Rex. Kessler called her that afternoon. "You've seen the counter-complaint." "I've seen it. It's going to create a procedural delay. His counsel is arguing that the CID investigation was improperly initiated, that it should have gone through Brigade first." "It couldn't go through Brigade. Brigade's reporting chain runs through Mercer." "We know that. Establishing it formally takes time." A pause. "Are you holding up?" She almost said fine, the automatic answer she had given every time someone asked for 2 weeks. Instead, she said, "I'm tired." "That's honest. I'm also not going anywhere." "I know." Another pause. "Garrett gave his full statement this morning. It's significant." Something in her chest tightened. "How significant?" "He corroborated everything you submitted regarding the motor pool conversation, the intent, the planning, who knew what and when. He also disclosed 2 prior incidents he personally witnessed that he never reported." Kessler's voice was careful. "He's been carrying those for 14 months. She thought about Garrett's face after he'd gotten up from the pavement, the silence he'd maintained throughout the entire MP processing, the arithmetic she had known he was doing. He'd done the math, and he had chosen correctly. "Is he protected?" she asked. "Cooperating witness status, yes." "Good." She paused. "He's 26 years old. He made a bad decision for 14 months and a right one when it counted. That should mean something. Kessler was quiet for a moment. It does, he said. He hung up. She sat with Rex in the evening quiet and thought about what 14 months of silence felt like from the inside. She had her own version of it, not the same, not as long, but she understood the weight of knowing something and choosing not to say it, because the cost of saying it seemed unsurvivable. She understood why Garrett had waited. She was glad he had finally spoken. The next 10 days were the slowest she had lived through in years. The CID investigation expanded formally. The Army Inspector General's office opened a parallel inquiry into the administrative closeout practices across the 4 installations. The congressional oversight request that had been quietly circulating in Washington was upgraded to a formal inquiry by the Armed Services Committee, which meant that the name Brigadier General Alan Mercer was now appearing in documents that required responses within specific legal timelines. Mercer hired a defense attorney within 72 hours of his administrative hold. That told her everything she needed to know about how frightened he was. Park gave her updates when he had them, always briefly, always in person, never through channels connected to the base system. Okafor checked on her every morning with a single text. A question mark. Nothing else. And Lena answered with a thumbs up. Nothing else. And they had built a language out of absolute minimalism that said everything necessary. Reyes called once. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Waiting," Lena said. "That's the hardest part." "I know. For what it's worth." Reyes said, "The IG inquiry found the same signature I found, in the same files. They're not going to be able to explain it away." A pause. "It's holding, Lena. Everything you built is holding." She thanked her and hung up and did not let herself feel relief yet, because the court-martial hadn't started. And Crowley was still talking. The Article 32 preliminary hearing, the military equivalent of a grand jury, determining whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to court-martial, was held on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the motor pool incident. Lena sat outside the hearing room for 4 hours. Rex lay at her feet with his chin on his forepaws. She had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, and she breathed steadily and thought about nothing she didn't need to think about. At the 2-hour mark, Park appeared from down the hallway and sat beside her without being asked. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. "Rice is in there," he said finally. "Dana Rice. She flew in from Atlanta." Lena looked at him. "She testified voluntarily," Park said. "Walked in this morning. Her attorney submitted her statement before the hearing opened." He paused. "Pam Cho sent a written declaration. She's not ready to testify in person, but she gave them the declaration." Lena felt something in her throat tighten. "Pamela Cho, who has 2 kids in Hawaii, filed a written declaration," she said. "Yes?" She breathed in slowly. "And Torres?" "Torres is on video testimony. She's been working with the congressional investigator. She submitted a simultaneous declaration to the IG inquiry and the Article 32. Park's voice was steady, but something in it had gone thick with something he didn't have a word for. "The prosecutor told me this morning that between Garrett's direct testimony, the harness camera footage, Okafor's recorded phone line, the 4 installation administrative trail, and 4 separate victim statements, the hearing officer took approximately 90 minutes. To recommend court-martial?" "Yes." She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them. "Mercer," she asked. "Separate proceeding. His counsel is arguing for administrative resolution rather than criminal prosecution. The IG is pushing back." Park's jaw tightened slightly. "It's messier at that level. More political. But it's moving." She nodded. Rex lifted his head and looked at her face, reading whatever he read there. His tail moved once. She reached down and laid her hand across the back of his neck. "Okay," she said quietly. The court-martial itself began on a Monday 6 weeks later. The proceeding had been moved to a larger facility, not because of logistical need, but because the volume of submitted evidence required physical space. 17 binders of documentation. Harness camera footage. 4 hours of recorded audio from Okafor's open phone line. Administrative records from 4 installations spanning 8 years. Testimony from 6 witnesses, including 3 of the 5 women who had been silenced over the course of Crowley's career. Lena testified on the 3rd day. She had testified before in operational after-action contexts in administrative proceedings, once in a classified congressional subcommittee setting that she still could not discuss. She knew how to sit in a chair and answer questions with precision and control. What she had not done before was sit in a military courtroom and describe what it felt like to have her arm twisted in front of 300 witnesses and know that every one of those witnesses would stay silent because the institution had already taught them what silence cost less than speaking. The prosecutor, a JAG major named Chen, who had a gift for economy, for asking exactly the question that produced exactly the answer that needed to exist in the record, led her through 12 days of documented timeline with the precision of someone assembling something that needed to be airtight. Crowley's defense counsel cross-examined her for 40 minutes. They questioned her access to administrative files. They questioned Rex's behavior as unpredictable. They questioned the legality of the body camera recording in a non-operational setting. They questioned her motive, her judgment, her state of mind during the combative seminar. She answered every question with 3-word sentences when 3 words were sufficient, and longer sentences when they weren't. And she did not raise her voice, and she did not become emotional, and she did not give them a single opening. At one point, defense counsel leaned forward and said, "Sergeant Vance, isn't it possible that what you interpreted as intentional force during the combatives demonstration was simply a training error by a senior officer under time pressure?" Lena looked at him. "No," she said. "You can't know his intent. The medical documentation indicates a partial ligament stress injury consistent with intentional joint torque applied at an angle that no trained combatives instructor would use for a demonstration." She paused. "I also have 23 years of experience identifying the difference between training force and harmful force in Syria, in 2 other classified operating environments, and in 12 years of K-9 work where reading intent from physical behavior is a survival skill." She held his gaze. "So no, it was not a training error." Defense counsel moved to his next question. Rex was present in the courtroom. He had been authorized as a service animal during proceedings, a designation that had required its own legal argument and its own documented precedent. He sat beside Lena's chair in his working harness and watched the room with the same patient, absolute attention he brought to everything. Several members of the panel, the military jury, watched him throughout the proceedings. Animals change rooms, not because they perform anything, because their presence requires people to remember that what's happening is real, that there are things which are not institutional, not procedural, not arguable things that simply are. Rex was simply Rex, and that was enough. On the 4th day of testimony, something happened that no one in the room had expected. A witness no one had subpoenaed walked in. She was a woman in her mid-30s. Civilian clothes. Dark hair pulled back with the particular bearing of someone who had once been military and had never fully left it behind in her posture or her eyes. She approached the JAG prosecutor in the hallway during a recess and handed him a USB drive in a sealed envelope. Lena learned about it from Chen during a 15-minute break. "Her name is Captain Maya Sorrell," he said, keeping his voice low. "Separated from the Army in 2015. Not in any of the files you built. She was stationed at Fort Polk, not in the 4 installation pattern your investigator identified." Lena stared at him. "That means Mercer was doing this before 2016, she said. "Before 2016. Before Fort Campbell. Before the pattern we identified started." Chen's voice was careful and precise. "She has documentation of a complaint filed in 2014 that was closed in 8 days under Mercer's signature at a time when he was still a colonel." He paused. "It goes back further than anyone knew." Lena felt the weight of that settle. 11 years, not 8. 11 years of women. "How did she know to come?" Lena asked. "She saw coverage of the Article 32 proceeding in a military news outlet. She's been carrying the documentation for 11 years. Chen met her eyes. She said she kept it because she thought someday someone would be able to use it. She just didn't know when. Lena was quiet for a long moment. Is she going to testify? She's requested to. We're processing the authorization now. He paused. Lena, this changes the scope of the Mercer proceeding significantly. If his conduct predates what the IG identified by 3 years, the administrative resolution argument his counsel is pushing collapses entirely. She understood what he was telling her. The protection Crowley had relied on for 8 years. The architecture that had made him untouchable across 4 installations was itself built on a foundation that went deeper and darker than anyone had realized when this started. And a woman named Maya Sorrell had walked into a courtroom with a USB drive she'd been holding for 11 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Lena looked at the ceiling for a second. She thought about patience, about the kind of patience that doesn't come from comfort or security, but from something harder, from knowing that the truth is a weight that only gets heavier the longer you carry it alone, and carrying it anyway, because the alternative is letting it disappear. 5 women in the files she'd built. 1 more she hadn't known about. 6 women who had each alone in different years in different places decided that the cost of silence was something they were willing to absorb because the cost of speaking seemed unsurvivable. 6 women who had been right about the cost and wrong about the unsurvivability. The verdict came on a Friday morning. The military panel deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Lena sat in the hallway outside with Rex and Park and Okafor and said almost nothing for the duration. Okafor held a paper cup of coffee she never drank. Park sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes forward. Davenport had been allowed to attend as a supporting witness, and he sat at the far end of the bench, young and very still, watching the closed door, with the expression of someone for whom this moment was the first time they had seen an institution do what it was supposed to do. When the door opened, Chen came out first. He didn't smile. JAG officers didn't perform reaction for an audience, but his face had something in it that told her everything before he said a word. Guilty on all counts, he said quietly. Assault, conduct unbecoming, abuse of authority, criminal intimidation, conspiracy. He paused. Rank reduction to lieutenant colonel pending appeal. Forfeiture of pay. The panel recommended dismissal. Dismissal. Not resignation, not retirement with benefits. Dismissal, the military equivalent of dishonorable discharge for an officer carrying the full weight of what that record meant for every day that followed. Okafor made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Park stood up and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Davenport put his face in his hands, not crying, just absorbing. Lena sat still. Rex stood up beside her and pressed his head against her arm. She put both hands around his face and looked at him, the gray coming in around his muzzle. Now the old scars under his fur, that she knew by feel, the dark eyes that had watched her through 12 days of this, and every day of 6 deployments before it, the unwavering presence that had never once in their years together asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. "We did it," she told him. His tail moved slowly. The Mercer proceeding concluded 4 months later. It was messier, as Park had predicted. Generals did not go quietly. There were attorneys and delays and procedural arguments, and one particularly ugly week in which an anonymous source leaked a version of events to a military news outlet that painted Lena as a motivated complainant who had constructed a narrative around circumstantial administrative data. She did not respond publicly. She did not have to. Reyes responded. Through her own channels, through the documentation that had been placed in 3 separate locations outside the base 11 weeks before any of this became public. Through 14 pages of cross-referenced administrative evidence that had already been in the hands of the congressional inquiry for months before anyone tried to reframe the story. The IG report was released on a Thursday. It ran to 63 pages. It confirmed 11 years of systematic pattern. It named Mercer specifically and unambiguously. It recommended permanent revocation of his retirement benefits and referral to the Department of Justice for criminal conspiracy charges. The Army Secretary issued a public statement the following Monday. Lena read it once, noted the language, and set it down. Statements were statements. What mattered was the 63 pages. What mattered was Rice and Cho and Torres and Sorrell and the 2 women in the files who had separated from the Army and whom Kessler's team was still trying to locate. What mattered was that the documentation existed and was public and could not be buried again. 3 weeks after Mercer's proceeding concluded, Lena received a letter. Not an email, a physical letter handwritten sent through her unit's administrative mail. She didn't recognize the return address. She opened it at the kennel, Rex beside her. It was from a woman named Private First Class Ania Hollins, stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia. 22 years old, 8 months into her first enlistment. She had read coverage of the court-martial in a military family newsletter someone had passed around her barracks. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described something that had happened to Hollins 4 months ago during a unit training exercise. Something she had not reported. Something she had been afraid to report because she had watched what happened to women who reported, and she had calculated that silence was what survival required. The second paragraph said that reading about Rex, about a military working dog who had responded to what humans had chosen to ignore, had made her believe for the first time that the system could be something other than what she'd seen it be. The third paragraph said, I filed a report this morning. I want you to know that the reason I did it is because of what you did. I don't know if it will go anywhere, but I filed it, and whatever happens, I filed it. Lena read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands for a moment. She thought about the 300 soldiers who had stood silent on that field 6 months ago. She thought about the ones who had watched a major twist a woman's arm in front of them and said nothing, not because they were bad people, but because the institution had taught them that silence was the price of belonging to it. She thought about what it cost to break that silence. What it cost Rice and Cho and Torres and Sorrell and Garrett and Davenport and Park and Okafor. What it cost Ania Hollins at Fort Stewart on a morning 4 months after something had happened to her that she'd been afraid to name. She thought about what it cost to be the first person to speak. And she thought about what it cost to stay silent. She looked at Rex. His muzzle was more gray than it had been 6 months ago. He was 9 years old, which in the life of a combat-deployed Belgian Malinois was not young. His body was a record of everything they had been through together. Scars she knew by name, movements that told her when something ached, the way he slept closer to her on cold nights than warm ones. He was looking at her with those unwavering dark eyes, reading her face, reading whatever he always read there. One more thing, she told him. She wrote back to Ania Hollins that afternoon. A single page, handwritten, no rank, no formal salutation, just her name at the top, and the truth at the bottom. She wrote, You did the hardest thing. Everything after this is just persistence, and you have already proven you have that. Keep going. You are not alone. You were never alone. There were just too many of us who didn't know where the others were yet. She sealed it and addressed it and handed it to the administrative clerk with her outgoing mail. Then she went back to the kennel. Rex was waiting at the gate. She clipped his lead, and they walked out together into the late afternoon, the dog's shoulder against her thigh, her hand at her side, the two of them moving with the easy synchronized rhythm of a pair that had crossed too much ground together to need anything more than presence. She thought about what Park had said. I thought I'd seen the best and the worst of what people are capable of. She thought he was right. She thought she had seen both in the same 12 weeks. And she thought the best had won not easily, not without cost, not without the specific irreversible damage that truth always leaves behind when it tears through something that was built to suppress it. But it had won. 6 women had spoken. 1 institution had been forced to look at itself. 1 man who had spent 22 years believing the system would protect him from accountability had discovered finally that systems are not permanent, that they hold exactly as long as the people inside them are willing to make them hold, and not 1 day longer. Nathan Crowley would stand before a federal review board within the month. Alan Mercer's retirement application had been formally denied. And in Fort Stewart, Georgia, a 22-year-old private named Anaya Hollins had filed a report on a morning she had not expected to be brave. Lena walked until the light shifted and the air cooled, and Rex slowed his pace beside her in the way he did when he was ready to stop. She stopped. She looked at the dog beside her. This animal, who had given her more than she had ever asked of him, who had been present in every worst moment and every small victory, who had stood between her and a man twice her size, and done what needed to be done, because that was simply what he was. She had been told once early in her K-9 training that the relationship between a handler and a working dog was one of mutual trust, that the handler had to be worthy of what the animal gave, and the animal had to be worthy of what the handler asked. She had spent 9 years trying to be worthy. She thought, standing there in the late light with Rex's shoulder against her leg, that maybe she had gotten close enough. "Good boy," she said softly. He looked up at her. The gray in his muzzle caught the light. She reached down and placed her hand on the side of his face. His jaw warm, his eyes steady, his breathing slow and even, and completely at peace. And Lena Vance understood, with the finality of something that had fully arrived, that justice doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from a woman who refuses to be quiet, from a dog who refuses to look away, from a private at Fort Stewart who mailed a report on a morning she hadn't planned to be brave. It comes from the ones the institution counted on to stay silent, who didn't.